They called him the Scourge of God, a name whispered in terror across 2 continents. A man whose very approach emptied cities, whose shadow fell across the greatest empire the world had ever known. Attila the Hun. His armies didn't just conquer territory, they shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. They proved that even an empire that had stood for centuries, that had defeated every enemy, that had convinced itself it would last forever, even that empire could be brought to its knees. For nearly 2 decades, Attila held the fate of Europe in his hands. Emperors paid him tribute, generals feared him, entire populations fled at the rumor of his coming. But who was he really? A bloodthirsty barbarian driven by chaos and cruelty? Or a brilliant strategist who understood power better than the Romans themselves? This is the story of how one man from the steppes of Asia became the nightmare that ended an age. How he turned Rome's strength into its weakness. How he came closer than anyone before him to destroying Western civilization as it existed. If you enjoy epic, true stories that change the course of history, subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about barbarians, empires, and the thin line between order and chaos. Let's begin in a world on the edge of collapse. To understand Attila, you have to understand the Rome he faced. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was split. The Western Empire, ruled from Ravenna in Italy, and the Eastern Empire, commanded from Constantinople. They shared a common heritage, a common culture, but increasingly they operated as separate entities, sometimes allies, often rivals, and both were exhausted. Centuries of expansion had created an empire too vast to defend efficiently. The borders stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Middle East. Thousands of miles of frontier, all requiring soldiers, fortifications, constant vigilance. But Rome's legions weren't what they used to be. The citizen soldiers who'd conquered the Mediterranean world were gone, replaced by professional armies increasingly filled with foreign recruits, including many from the very tribes Rome claimed to be defending against. The economy was strained. Constant wars required constant taxation. The wealthy elite hoarded their fortunes while the tax burden fell on everyone else. Cities declined. Infrastructure crumbled. The western provinces, especially, showed signs of systemic decay. And then there were the migrations. For decades, tribal peoples from beyond the Rhine and Danube have been pushing into Roman territory, not as conquerors, initially, but as refugees. They were fleeing something that terrified them more than Rome itself. They were fleeing the Huns. The Huns appeared in European historical records around 370 CE, seemingly from nowhere. They came from the Eurasian steppes, nomadic horsemen whose origins remain debated even today. Some scholars link them to the Xiongnu, who'd terrorized China centuries earlier. Others see them as a confederation of different steppe peoples united by circumstance and conquest. What's certain is their impact. The Huns were masters of mounted warfare. They fought on horseback with composite bows, weapons that could pierce armor a considerable distance. They moved faster than any army Rome had faced. They struck without warning, destroyed or captured everything valuable, and vanished before Roman forces could respond. But more than their military tactics, it was their otherness that terrified Rome. They looked different. They lived differently, following their herds, dwelling in tents, existing entirely on horseback. Roman chroniclers described them with a mixture of fascination and horror. They call the Huns barely human, demons in flesh, a punishment sent by God. This wasn't just military threat, it was existential dread. The Huns represented everything Rome defined itself against. Civilization versus barbarism, order versus chaos, the settled world versus the savage frontier. And then, in the 430s, 2 brothers inherited leadership of the Hunnic Confederation. Their names were Bleda and Attila. For a decade, they ruled jointly. expanding Hunnic power through the Balkans, extracting tribute from Constantinople, building an empire of their own. But in 445 CE, Bleda died under mysterious circumstances. Many historians believe Attila killed him, and with Bleda gone, Attila became the sole ruler of the Huns, a position he would hold for just 8 years. But 8 years that would change everything. We know surprisingly little about Attila's early life. The Huns left no written records of their own. Everything we know comes from Roman and Gothic sources. People who feared him, fought him, or served him. But we can piece together a portrait. Attila was born sometime around 406 CE, probably in the vast territory north of the Danube River. He grew up in a world of constant warfare, where survival meant mastering horsemanship, archery, and the brutal politics of steppe leadership. By the time he and his brother inherited power, Attila had spent years as a hostage in Roman courts, a common practice where potential rivals were held to ensure their people's cooperation. This gave him something most barbarian leaders lacked: intimate knowledge of Roman self. He learned Latin. He understood Roman politics, their bureaucracy, their military organization. He saw their weakness up close. The corruption, the internal divisions, the gap between Rome's self-image and its reality. And he was intelligent, brutally, strategically intelligent. Roman sources, even hostile ones, acknowledge this. The historian Priscus, who actually met Attila on a diplomatic mission, described him as shrewd, calculating, capable of both charm and calculated cruelty. He wasn't a raging barbarian of legend. He was a politician and a general who understood that fear could be more effective than force. When Bleda died and Attila took sole command, he immediately began consolidating power. He eliminated potential rivals within the Hunnic Confederation. He brought various steppe tribes under his direct control. He built a court, established protocols, created the apparatus of empire. Because that's what Attila was building, an empire, not like Rome's. He had no interest in permanent conquest, in cities and agriculture and settled administration, but an empire nonetheless. A vast tribute-extracting operation where conquered peoples paid to be left alone, where the threat of Hunnic invasion kept gold and supplies flowing to Attila's headquarters. And where was that headquarters? On the Hungarian plains, in a sprawling complex the Romans simply called Attila's court. It was part military camp, part royal capital, filled with plundered treasures from across Europe. Gothic nobles and Roman ambassadors both came here to negotiate, to bribe, to plead. Attila's leadership style was deliberately theatrical. He understood the power of reputation. He cultivated his image as invincible, unpredictable, divinely favored. He claimed to possess the Sword of Mars, the war god's own weapon, supposedly discovered by a Hunnic shepherd, a calculated piece of propaganda that suggested a divine right to conquest. He was also capable of extraordinary cruelty. When cities resisted, he made examples. When treaties were broken, he responded with overwhelming force. He understood that a reputation for mercilessness reduced future resistance. But he was also pragmatic. He negotiated constantly. He made deals. He played Roman factions against each other when he could achieve his goals through diplomacy and intimidation. He preferred that to actual warfare because Attila understood something crucial. His strength was also his vulnerability. The Hunnic Confederation was held together by success, by victories, by plunder, by the constant flow of tribute from terrified neighbors. If that stopped, if Attila appeared weak, the Confederation would fracture. Rival chiefs would challenge him. Subject peoples would rebel. He had to keep winning, or at least keep appearing invincible. And for most of his reign, he did. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, fought in June of 451 CE, was a clash unlike anything Europe had seen in generations. On one side, Attila's multi-ethnic confederation, dominated by Hunnic cavalry, but including Gothic and Germanic infantry. warriors from the steppes and forests who'd been united by conquest and the promise of Roman plunder. On the other, Aetius' coalition of Romans, Visigoths, Franks, and other tribes. Old enemies fighting together because the alternative, Hunnic domination, was worse. The battle lasted all day. The sources describe brutal, chaotic fighting, cavalry charges, infantry phalanxes colliding, hand-to-hand slaughter across muddy fields. The Visigothic king, Theodoric I, died in the fighting. So did tens of thousands of others. The carnage was immense, and at the end of the day, neither side had won decisively. Attila withdrew to his camp, prepared fortifications, and waited. Some sources say he planned to burn himself alive on a massive funeral pyre if the Romans breached his defenses, a final act of defiance rather than capture. But Aetius didn't attack. This decision has puzzled historians ever since. Why not press the advantage? Why not destroy Attila's army while it was vulnerable? The most compelling explanation is political calculation. Aetius understood that Attila, for all his threat, served a purpose. He kept the various Germanic tribes in check. He justified the Roman military establishment in the west. If Attila were completely destroyed, Aetius would lose his most useful enemy, and with it, his own relevance and power. So he let Attila withdraw. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was celebrated as a great Roman victory. Aetius was hailed as the savior of the West. Churches across the Christian world gave thanks for deliverance. But Attila hadn't been defeated. Not really. He'd been checked, contained, but his army was still intact, his power still formidable. And he wasn't finished. The following year, 452 CE, Attila invaded Italy itself. This time there was no coalition waiting, no allied army to meet him. The Western Roman defenses crumbled. Cities fell one after another. Aquileia, a major city at the northern end of the Adriatic, resisted for months. When it finally fell, Attila's forces destroyed it so completely that refugees fleeing the carnage fled to nearby islands, where they established new settlements. Those settlements would eventually become Venice, a city literally born from the terror of Attila's invasion. Milan fell. Verona fell. Other cities opened their gates without resistance, hoping to avoid Aquileia's fate. The road to Rome itself lay open, and then, inexplicably, Attila stopped. He was at the Po River, within striking distance of the Eternal City, when a delegation arrived, led by Pope Leo I, later called Leo the Great. The delegation offered to negotiate. We don't know exactly what was said at that meeting. The sources give us only fragments. Church tradition claims that Leo's spiritual authority and eloquent appeals to mercy convinced Attila to withdraw. The more prosaic explanation involves money, lots of money, and possibly the threat of reinforcements arriving from Constantinople. There's also evidence that plague had broken out in Attila's army. His supply lines were stretched. His forces were exhausted from continuous campaigning. And unlike Alaric the Visigoth, who'd sacked Rome in 410, Attila understood that actually capturing the city would bring him nothing but problems. Rome was symbolic, but strategically worthless. It had no real defenses, no significant wealth left to plunder. Taking it would satisfy his warriors' bloodlust, but wouldn't advance his strategic goals. So he negotiated. He accepted tribute, secured promises of future payments, and withdrew. For the second time, Attila had brought Rome to its knees without having to destroy it. It seemed, in that moment, that he was invincible, that he perfected a system of extracting maximum wealth and prestige with minimal risk, that he could continue this indefinitely, bleeding Rome dry while avoiding the costs of actual conquest. But he had less than a year left to live. While Rome trembled and emperors paid tribute, what was life actually like in Attila's court? What kind of man sat at the center of this empire of fear? We have a remarkable eyewitness account. In 449 CE, the Eastern Roman Emperor sent a diplomatic mission to Attila's headquarters on the Hungarian plains. Among the delegation was a historian named Priscus of Hunnic, and his descriptions give us our most detailed portrait of Attila as a living, breathing person, not just a legend. The journey itself was revealing. The Roman ambassadors traveled for weeks through territory that had once been part of the empire. They passed burned cities, abandoned villages, and peoples who now paid tribute to the Huns. The landscape itself bore witness to Attila's power. When they finally reached his court, they found something unexpected. Not a crude barbarian camp, but a sophisticated political center. Attila's compound was a massive complex of wooden buildings, halls, residences, administrative structures. It was permanent, organized, designed to impress and intimidate visitors. Gothic nobles lived there, Germanic chiefs, Roman defectors who'd thrown in their lot with the Huns. There were translators, scribes, advisors from a dozen different peoples. This wasn't a wandering horde. It was the capital of an empire. Priscus describes being received by Attila himself. And here's where the account becomes fascinating, because it contradicts almost everything Roman propaganda had taught people to expect. Attila was short, broad-chested, powerfully built, but not the towering giant of legend. He had a flat nose, a thin beard, small eyes that Priscus described as constantly moving, assessing, calculating. His skin was dark from years of sun exposure. But what struck Priscus most was Attila's behavior at the feast held in the ambassador's honor. The hall was filled with elaborate displays of wealth. Gold plates, silver cups, fine cloths, captured Roman treasures displayed deliberately to remind visitors where this wealth came from. Attila's chieftains and nobles ate and drank from these treasures, gorging themselves on meat and wine, celebrating their victories and their plunder. But Attila himself, he ate from a wooden plate, drank from a wooden cup, wore simple clothing without decoration. While everyone around him indulged, he remained austere, almost ascetic. This wasn't poverty. It was theater, calculated image building. Attila understood that excessive display of wealth made a leader look soft, decadent, Roman. By maintaining simplicity in the midst of plenty, he reinforced his image as a warrior king, a man who valued strength over luxury, victory over comfort. He also demonstrated absolute control. He could have all these treasures, but chose not to use them. That restraint was a form of power. During the negotiations, Priscus witnessed Attila's political skill firsthand. The Hun king played the Roman factions against each other. He had spies in Constantinople who kept him informed of palace intrigues. He knew which officials could be bribed, which could be intimidated, which held real power versus ceremonial positions. He negotiated like a Roman senator, demanding, compromising, extracting maximum concessions while giving minimum ground. He used translators strategically, creating delays when he needed time to think, switching between languages to keep his opponents off balance. And he was terrifying when he wanted to be. Priscus describes Attila's eyes flashing with rage during tense moments, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper, his ability to make trained diplomats, men who negotiated with emperors, feel suddenly vulnerable and very far from home. But he could also be charming. He joked with his warriors. He showed affection to his children. He had many sons from different wives. He listened to entertainers, enjoyed music, rewarded loyalty generously. This complexity is what Roman propaganda erased. They needed Attila to be a monster, pure and simple. But the man Priscus met was far more dangerous than any simple monster. He was intelligent, adaptable, and absolutely ruthless when circumstances required it. One incident from Priscus' account reveals Attila's character perfectly. The Roman delegation had secretly been instructed to assassinate Attila. One of the ambassadors, a man named Vigilus, had been recruited by corrupt officials in Constantinople to poison or murder the Hun king. Attila knew. His intelligence network had uncovered the plot before the Romans even arrived. But he didn't kill Vigilus immediately. He let the mission proceed. He watched. He gathered evidence. And then, at the perfect moment, he exposed the conspiracy publicly, humiliating Constantinople, proving that Roman treachery justified his demands, and giving himself leverage for even more tribute. He sent Vigilus back to Constantinople with a message: bring more gold, or the war continues. The Eastern Empire paid. This was Attila at his most dangerous. Patient, informed, willing to let his enemies trap themselves before springing his own trap. Attila wasn't just a warrior king. He was a husband, a father, and the center of a complex web of family alliances that held his empire together. He had multiple wives. The sources mention at least 6 by name, and there were probably more. These weren't just marriages. They were political alliances. Each wife represented a connection to a different tribe, a different people brought into the Hunnic confederation through family bonds. His favorite, according to multiple sources, was a woman named Priscus. She seems to have been his primary wife, the mother of his eldest sons, and a figure of genuine influence in his court. When Priscus visited, he met Priscus and noted that she lived in her own substantial compound within Attila's headquarters, managing her own household, receiving visitors. This suggests something important. Attila's empire wasn't just him. There was a structure, a court, an administrative apparatus that required management. And women, particularly high-status wives and mothers of potential heirs, played crucial roles. His sons were being groomed for power. The eldest, Ellen, was clearly the favorite to succeed. Attila took him on campaigns, taught him strategy, gave him command units. Dingizic and Hunnic, younger sons, were also being prepared, creating the potential for succession disputes that would indeed fracture the empire after Attila's death. But beyond his immediate family, Attila maintained a network of foster relationships and political marriages that extended throughout his empire. Germanic chiefs sent their sons to be raised in Attila's court, ostensibly as honor, actually as hostages. Attila's daughters were married to allied kings and chieftains, spreading his influence. He also cultivated relationships with Roman defectors. The most notable was a man named Orestes, a Roman from a good family, who'd become one of Attila's most trusted secretaries and advisors. Orestes spoke perfect Latin, understood Roman bureaucracy, and served as Attila's primary liaison with Roman officials. Interestingly, Orestes would later return to the Western Roman Empire after Attila's death. His son, Romulus Augustulus, would become the last Western Roman emperor in 476 CE. A strange historical connection between Attila and Rome's final collapse. Attila's court also included craftsmen, merchants, and artists from across Europe and Asia. He commissioned works in gold and silver. He appreciated fine weapons, beautiful horses, exotic goods. He wasn't the crude barbarian who destroyed everything beautiful. He collected it, displayed it, used it to demonstrate his power and sophistication. But there was always an edge to his generosity. Loyalty was rewarded magnificently. Betrayal was punished without mercy. When Gothic nobles who'd pledged allegiance were caught conspiring against him, Attila had them executed publicly. When a Gepid chief questioned his authority, Attila destroyed his entire settlement as a warning. When Roman deserters in his service tried to play both sides, they simply disappeared. The message was clear. Attila could be the most generous lord in the world, showering you with gold and position, or he could be your executioner. The choice was yours, but choose carefully. This combination of generosity and terror, of sophistication and savagery, kept his empire functioning. People stayed loyal not just from fear, but because serving Attila successfully brought rewards that no other leader could offer. While Attila is remembered primarily as a military threat, his true genius lay in diplomacy and political manipulation. He understood that actual warfare was expensive, risky, and potentially destabilizing to his own power base. Extracting tribute through the threat of war was far more profitable. His relationship with the Western Roman general Aetius was particularly complex and revealing. Aetius had spent time as a hostage among the Huns in Italy. He and Attila possibly knew each other personally. They certainly understood each other, and for years, they engaged in a delicate dance where both used the other for their own purposes. Aetius employed Hunnic auxiliaries in Roman civil wars. He borrowed Hunnic cavalry to defeat rival Roman generals and consolidate his own power. In exchange, he allowed Attila to raid Roman territory with minimal interference, provided tribute when demanded, and generally treated the Hun king as a legitimate power rather than a barbarian threat. This suited Attila perfectly. He got gold, supplies, and legitimacy without having to actually conquer and administer Roman territory, something he had no interest in doing. The famous invasion of Gaul in 451 CE wasn't a sudden explosion of barbarian rage. It was the culmination of years of diplomatic maneuvering, broken agreements, and calculated escalation. The whole affair with Princess Honoria, supposedly asking Attila to rescue her and claiming he should receive half the Western empires or dowry, was almost certainly manufactured, or at least deliberately exaggerated by Attila as a pretext. He needed a justification for war that sounded legitimate to his own followers and to neutral observers. I'm attacking because a Roman princess has asked for my help and promised me territory sounded better than I'm attacking because I want more gold. But even during the invasion, Attila kept diplomatic channels open. He negotiated with cities. He offered terms. He accepted surrenders and bribes. The wholesale destruction was reserved for those who resisted, and even then, it was strategic. Make an example of one city to terrify 10 others into submission. After the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, which was at best a draw and at worst a tactical setback for Attila, he didn't slink away in defeat. He withdrew in good order, maintained his army's cohesion, and immediately began planning the next campaign. The invasion of Italy the following year was even more sophisticated. Attila had learned from Gaul. He moved faster, struck harder, and avoided getting bogged down in prolonged sieges. When cities resisted, he bypassed them or used psychological warfare, rumors of atrocities, exaggerated reports of his army's size, to break their will. The meeting with Pope Leo the First at the Po River has been mythologized by Christian tradition as a spiritual victory, with Leo's eloquence and divine authority convincing Attila to spare Rome. The reality was almost certainly more mundane and more interesting. Attila sat down with Leo and his delegation and conducted a cost-benefit analysis. Attacking Rome would be difficult, expensive, and strategically pointless. The city had no real wealth left. Decades of decline had seen to that. It was symbolically important, but militarily irrelevant. On the other hand, accepting a massive tribute payment, securing promises of future gold, and withdrawing voluntarily made him look magnanimous rather than defeated. It maintained his reputation for being open to negotiation. It gave his warriors plunder without casualties, and crucially, it left the Western Roman Empire still standing, still capable of paying him in the future. Attila didn't want to destroy Rome. He wanted to milk it. Dead cows produce no milk. This pragmatism extended to his treatment of the Eastern Empire as well. After his Balkan campaigns devastated the region in the 440s, he could have pushed toward Constantinople itself. The city's famous walls were formidable, but not impregnable. With enough time and resources, he might have taken it. But besieging Constantinople would have tied down his army for months, possibly years. It would have cost enormous casualties. It would have required him to maintain supply lines across hostile territory. And even if he won, then what? He'd be left administering a massive city that hated him, draining his resources, requiring permanent occupation. Instead, he negotiated. He got everything he really wanted: gold, recognition, tribute, buffer zones, without the cost of conquest. This is what made Attila so dangerous. He wasn't a mindless destroyer. He was a calculating politician who understood that power comes in many forms, and sometimes the threat of destruction is more valuable than destruction itself. Strip away the legend, the terror, the diplomatic maneuvering. Who was Attila as a man? What was his daily existence like? We know from Priscus and other sources that Attila maintained a strict personal discipline that contrasted sharply with the behavior of those around him. While his warriors feasted and drank themselves into stupors, Attila remained controlled. This wasn't asceticism for its own sake. It was maintaining the edge, the alertness, the authority that leadership required. He was an early riser. His days began before dawn, reviewing reports from scouts, meeting with chieftains, planning movements. The Hunnic Empire operated on information, knowing where Roman forces were, which cities had weak defenses, which tribal groups might be convinced to join or intimidated into submission. Attila personally oversaw much of this intelligence gathering. He questioned scouts directly. He interviewed prisoners himself. He maintained a network of spies and informants that extended deep into Roman territory. Some were Huns, or allied tribesmen. Others were Roman citizens, slaves, merchants, corrupt officials, who fed him information for gold or revenge or survival. His military genius lay not in tactics, though he was competent in battle, but in strategic planning. He thought in terms of campaigns, not just fights. He understood logistics, supply lines, and the psychological impact of movements on both enemies and allies. Training was constant, even in his 40s. Elderly by the standards of steppe warriors, Attila rode daily, practiced archery, maintained his physical capabilities. He couldn't afford to look weak. Leadership among the Huns was based partly on demonstrated martial prowess. A king who couldn't ride, couldn't fight, wouldn't remain king for long. He also spent considerable time managing internal politics. The Hunnic Confederation was always on the verge of fracturing. Different tribes had different interests, old grudges, competing ambitions. Attila had to constantly balance factions, reward loyalty, punish dissent, and maintain the flow of victories and plunder that kept everyone invested in his leadership. This required a kind of political genius that's often overlooked. Managing a coalition of Huns, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Alans, and dozens of smaller groups, each with their own languages, customs, and agendas, was as impressive as any military victory. He judged disputes personally. Chieftains brought their grievances to Attila's court, and he rendered decisions that everyone accepted because the alternative, civil war within the Confederation, would benefit no one. He was also, by all accounts, a man capable of genuine affection. He loved his children, or at least some of them. He showed favoritism toward Elik, his eldest, in a way that suggested real emotional attachment, not just dynastic calculation. Priscus describes a moment at the feast where Attila's youngest son entered the hall. Attila's face softened. He smiled, something he rarely did in public. He called the boy over, touched his cheek, and spoke to him gently. It was a brief glimpse of the private man beneath the public persona of the Scourge of God. He appreciated music and entertainment. At the feast, Priscus mentions Gothic singers performing, and Attila listening with evident pleasure. He rewarded performers generously when they pleased him. But he was also capable of sudden violence. When angry, he could order executions on the spot. When betrayed, his retribution was swift and absolute. The contradictions weren't a flaw, they were deliberate. Unpredictability was another tool of control. No one could be quite sure which Attila they'd encounter. The generous host, the shrewd negotiator, the terrifying judge, or the brutal warrior. That uncertainty kept everyone off balance, always calculated. never quite comfortable. Strip away the legend, the terror, the diplomatic maneuver. Who was Attila as a man? What was his daily existence like? We know from Priscus and other sources that Attila maintained a strict personal discipline that contrasted sharply with the behavior of those around him. While his warriors feasted and drank themselves into stupors, Attila remained controlled. This wasn't asceticism for its own sake. It was maintaining the edge, the alertness, the authority that leadership required. He was an early riser. His days began before dawn, reviewing reports from scouts, meeting with chieftains, planning movements. The Hunnic Empire operated on information, knowing where Roman forces were, which cities had weak defenses, which tribal groups might be convinced to join or intimidated in submission. Attila personally oversaw much of this intelligence gathering. He questioned scouts directly. He interviewed prisoners himself. He maintained a network of spies and informants that extended deep into Roman territory. Some were Huns, or allied tribesmen. Others were Roman citizens, slaves, merchants, corrupt officials, who fed him information for gold or revenge or survival. His military genius lay not in tactics, though he was competent in battle, but in strategic planning. He thought in terms of campaigns, not just fights. He understood logistics, supply lines, and the psychological impact of movements on both enemies and allies. Training was constant, even in his 40s. Elderly by the standards of steppe warriors, Attila rode daily, practiced archery, maintained his physical capabilities. He couldn't afford to look weak. Leadership among the Huns was based partly on demonstrated martial prowess. A king who couldn't ride, couldn't fight, wouldn't remain king for long. He also spent considerable time managing internal politics. The Hunnic Confederation was always on the verge of fracturing. Different tribes had different interests, old grudges, competing ambitions. Attila had to constantly balance factions, reward loyalty, punish dissent, and maintain the flow of victories and plunder that kept everyone invested in his leadership. This required a kind of political genius that's often overlooked. Managing a coalition of Huns, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Alans, and dozens of smaller groups, each with their own languages, customs, and agendas, was as impressive as any military victory. He judged disputes personally. Chieftains brought their grievances to Attila's court, and he rendered decisions that everyone accepted because the alternative, civil war within the Confederation, would benefit no one. He was also, by all accounts, a man capable of genuine affection. He loved his children, or at least some of them. He showed favoritism toward Elif, his eldest, in a way that suggested real emotional attachment, not just dynastic calculation. Priscus describes a moment at the feast where Attila's youngest son entered the hall. Attila's face softened. He smiled, something he rarely did in public. He called the boy over, touched his cheek, and spoke to him gently. It was a brief glimpse of the private man beneath the public persona of the Scourge of God. He appreciated music and entertainment. At the feast, Priscus mentions Gothic singers performing, and Attila listening with evident pleasure. He rewarded performers generously when they pleased him, but he was also capable of sudden violence. When angry, he could order executions on the spot. When betrayed, his retribution was swift and absolute. The contradictions weren't a flaw, they were deliberate. Unpredictability was another tool of control. No one could be quite sure which Attila they would become. The generous host, the shrewd negotiator, the terrifying judge, or the brutal warrior. That uncertainty kept everyone off balance, always calculating, never quite comfortable. In 453 CE, at the height of his power, Attila took a new wife. Her name was Ildiko, and the circumstances of their marriage remained somewhat mysterious. Some sources suggest she was a Gothic or Burgundian princess, married to cement an alliance. Others hint she might have been a Roman, though this seems less likely. What's certain is that the wedding was celebrated with the kind of elaborate feast that had become typical at Attila's court. Wine flowed freely. Warriors celebrated. The hall rang with songs and boasts. Attila, according to multiple sources, drank more heavily than usual. This was noted because of his typical restraint. But on his wedding night, he apparently indulged, perhaps feeling secure, perhaps celebrating what he thought would be another successful alliance. He retired to his bedchamber with Ildiko. The door closed. The feast continued outside. By morning, Attila was dead. The servants found him lying in a pool of blood. Ildiko was discovered cowering in the corner, terrified, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened. She claimed she'd woken to find him already dead. The official account, preserved by Priscus and other historians, stated that Attila had suffered a severe nosebleed or hemorrhage, being drunk and lying on his back. He'd choked on his own blood and died during the night. It's medically plausible. Attila was in his late 40s, which was old for a steppe warrior. Years of hard living, battle injuries, stress, all could have contributed to a sudden hemorrhage. Combined with alcohol and sleeping position, death from choking on blood is entirely possible. But the timing was extraordinarily convenient for Rome. Within hours, alternative theories began circulating. Had Ildiko assassinated him? The Romans had tried before. Priscus documented one plot. Why not succeed where previous attempts had failed? A young bride, sent specifically to kill the Scourge of God on his wedding night, would require extraordinary courage and ruthlessness. But Rome had produced assassins before. Or had there been poison in the wine? Eastern Roman intelligence services were sophisticated. They had agents, resources, and massive motivation to eliminate Attila by any means necessary. Or was it internal? Had Attila's own people, tired of his dominance, arranged his death? He'd killed his brother Bleda to seize sole power. Why wouldn't his own sons or rivals do the same to him? We'll never know with certainty. What we do know is what happened next, and it tells us everything about the nature of Attila's empire. His warriors, when they discovered his death, went into elaborate mourning rituals. They cut their hair, slashed their faces with knives, and wailed in genuine grief. Whatever else Attila had been, he'd led them to victories and riches beyond anything their fathers could have imagined. They buried him in secret, following Hunnic customs. According to the historian Jordanes, writing a century later, they diverted a river, dug a grave in the riverbed, placed Attila's body surrounded by captured treasures, gold, weapons, the riches of a dozen campaigns, then returned the river to its course. The slaves who dug the grave were killed immediately, ensuring the location would remain secret forever. To this day, despite numerous searches and claims, Attila's burial place has never been definitively found. But the practical consequences of his death were immediate and catastrophic for the Hunnic Confederation. Attila had multiple sons from different wives. Elik, the eldest, claimed primacy, but Genghisic and Ernak had their own supporters. So did other sons whose names barely survive in sources. Within weeks, the empire fractured along the fault lines Attila had spent years managing. The subject peoples, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Heruli, and others, saw their opportunity. They'd been forced into Attila's confederation, compelled to fight his wars, required to pay him tribute. With Attila gone, they rebelled. At the Battle of Nideo in 454 CE, just a year after Attila's death, a coalition led by the Gepid king Ardaric destroyed the main Hunnic army. Elik died in the fighting. The Hunnic confederation shattered. The survivors scattered. Some fled back to the steppes, disappearing into the vast grasslands of Central Asia. Others tried to maintain smaller kingdoms, but without Attila's unifying presence, they couldn't hold territory or command loyalty. Within a generation, the Huns effectively ceased to exist as a distinct people. They were absorbed into other tribes, forgotten except as a terrifying memory. The empire of fear had been held together by one man's reputation, skill, and ruthlessness. Without him, there was nothing. No institutions, no shared identity, no reason for all these diverse peoples to remain united. Attila had built something remarkable, but he'd built it around himself, and when he died with him. So who was Attila the Hun? Strip away the propaganda, the legends, the centuries of myth-making. What's left? A man born on the steppes around 406 CE, into a world of constant warfare and migration. A man who grew up learning that survival meant strength, that weakness meant death, that power was the only currency that mattered. A man intelligent enough to learn from his enemies, who spent time in Roman courts as a hostage and came away understanding Rome better than most Romans understood themselves. A man who inherited partial leadership of a tribal confederation and, through a combination of strategic brilliance and probable fratricide, seized total control. A man who understood that fear could be more effective than force, that the threat of destruction often brought more profit than destruction itself. That reputation was a weapon as valuable as any sword. A man who built an empire from nothing, held it together for 8 years through sheer force of will, and watched it collapse within months of his death because he'd never built anything that could survive without him. Attila wasn't the mindless destroyer of Roman propaganda. He was too smart, too calculating, too politically sophisticated for that. He negotiated like a senator, thought strategically like a general, and understood power dynamics better than most of the civilized leaders who faced him. But he also wasn't a misunderstood hero. He ordered atrocities. He destroyed cities. He enslaved thousands. He used terror deliberately and effectively. The blood was real. The suffering was real. The destruction was real. He was a product of his time and circumstances. A world where violence was the universal language of power, where empires maintained control through brutality, where mercy was weakness and weakness meant death. What made Attila different wasn't his cruelty. It was his success. For nearly 2 decades, he made the mighty tremble. He extracted tribute from the wealthiest empire on earth. He proved that Rome's dominance wasn't inevitable, that even centuries of accumulated power could be challenged. And then he died in his bed, possibly from a nosebleed, and everything he built vanished like smoke. There's something almost tragic in that image. For all his power, all his victories, all his careful planning, he was ultimately mortal, vulnerable, gone in a moment. But his impact outlasted him. The migrations he triggered, the political changes he forced, the demonstration that Rome could be defeated, these rippled forward through history. When people remember Attila, they remember the Scourge of God, the barbarian destroyer. But the real Attila was more complex, more intelligent, and in some ways more frightening than any simple monster could be. He was a man who understood power, who wielded it brilliantly, and who ultimately couldn't escape the same truth that faces every conqueror, every empire, every person who reaches for greatness. Nothing lasts forever. Everything ends, and history remembers you not as you were, but as your enemies describe you. If this deep dive into who Attila really was changed how you see this chapter of history, do me a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. Knowing what you know now, was Attila the monster history painted him as? Or was he something more complicated? Thanks for watching. And remember, behind every legend is a human being making choices. Those choices echo through centuries. But the person, the actual, complex, contradictory person, gets lost in the mythology. We try to find him here. The man called the Scourge of God, the warrior king from the steppes, Attila.